So in today's lecture, we'll be looking at a number of things, but before we look at the specific methods, which will be 4 in total, I will start by making reference to the real estate finance structure, and then I'll look at the concept of forward funding as differentiated from the concept of forward sale, and then we'll look at bridging finance or gap financing, and then we'll end with mezzanine finance. So let's look at the structure of real estate finance. In the first lecture, we classified real estate finance by many forms as shown in this table. In particular, we said that finance could be for development or for investment or for both. We also said that finance could be project-based or for corporate or company-based. And under these two types of forms of finance, we said that finance may be equity or may be debt-based. Now, in this table, we would also realize that property finance, either for development or investment or both, tends to be project-based rather than company-based. Such funding is usually more expensive to service than corporate finance, particularly during the development stage. So in this lecture series, I'll be looking at 4 main project-based finance methods, which will include the different types of methods shaded in red. Here we'll be looking at forward funding, forward sale, bridge finance, and mezzanine finance. In the sections that follow, each of the methods of funding shaded in this table will be discussed in greater detail. So let's start with forward funding. Now, as the market is getting smaller and good, i.e. fully developed, real estate assets are harder to find. Many investors, even the conservative and risk-averse ones, turn to the acquisition of so-called real estate project development. From an investor's point of view, there are mainly 2 ways of acquiring such real estate project developments at a very early stage, either by way of concluding a forward funding agreement or a forward sale agreement. And here we'll be looking at the details of what a forward funding agreement is. So in a forward funding transaction, the parties, here we're looking at an investor and a developer, would conclude a sale and purchase agreement, usually, with development obligations of the seller at an early stage, often before development works have started, and sometimes even before planning permission has been secured. The purchase price, however, contrary to a forward sale transaction, will be made in installments, depending mainly on construction progress, but sometimes also depends on further requirements, i.e. securing of planning permission, conclusion of lease agreements, amendments of building permits, etc. The last installment of payment for the project will generally be paid after the usual purchase price maturity requirements. Such requirements may include 1, registration of the conveyance, that is the transfer of title from the developer to the investor, and this will be met, and the main tenant, for example, has also taken over the lease object, which is their unit, and preferably has also paid the first rent. The developer in such case has the advantage that no or very little bank financing is required, whereas the purchaser or the investor in this case apart from having a better yield, takes the insolvency risk and the general risk adherent to the construction works. In order to minimize the risk on the investor's side, not only the due diligence processes have to be more detailed, i.e. checking the validity of the local development plan, the contestability of the building permits, the solvency of the general contractor, the compliance of the general contractor agreement with the state of the art, but also the sales and purchase agreement has to provide for certain security mechanisms. So in summary, the obligations of the investor towards the developer and the developer towards the investor can be summarized as follows. So let's start with the investor. The investor may be required to sign the sales and purchase agreement. The investor would also be required to fund the construction cost, and this funding activity will be in the form of interim payments as and when progress is made on the construction works, and then the final payment will be made at the end of the construction works, and the developer has transferred title to the investor. The developer, on the other hand, will have these obligations towards the investor. One would be to secure planning permission, would also have to conclude lease agreements, would also have to do the necessary amendments to the building permit if required, would also have to register the conveyance instrument, would also have to make sure that tenants have taken over the lease object or their units after making their first payments. Now let's turn our attention to forward sale. With this form of funding, an investor gives a forward commitment to purchase a development on completion once agreed conditions have been met with regard to specification of the building and its letting. Contrary to a forward funding transaction, here the purchase price is however generally paid in full and not before completion of the development, with the developer funding the construction cost itself. The investor does not become involved with the development, but the commitment to buy it on completion allows the developer to borrow at a lower rate from a bank, since the bank avoids the risk of letting or sale. As an alternative to bank finance, the developer might negotiate a bridging finance or gap finance from the bank. So we'll be looking at gap financing later on. Now, the guarantee to purchase such as is given by the investor enables the developer to attract development funding more easily and cheaply. The cost of finance is likely to be greater in the case of the forward sale with a bridging loan, but the completed development will sell at a lower yield. There are some similarities and of course differences between a forward sale and a forward funding arrangement, which will be discussed later. But before we do that, let's look at the obligations of the investor towards the developer and the obligations of the developer towards the investor. Let's start with the investor. The investor will be required to agree on the conditions of sales and the purchase agreement, and here we also agree to make payment of full purchase price on completion of the development. The developer, on the other hand, would have to find funding for the construction cost. We also have to secure planning permit, and of course, when it comes to developer funding the construction cost, the developer would, in this case, use the guarantee provided by the investor to secure bridge finance from another financial institution. And of course, would also have to secure the planning permissions to be able to undertake the project. Now let's turn our attention to the differences between a forward funding agreement and a forward sale agreement. So let's look at the differences. Now, in a forward funding arrangement, the very first difference you would observe is that investors take the insolvency risk and the general risk adherent to construction. On the other hand, for a forward sale, there's no requirement to cover construction insolvency risk of the developer. The second difference we would observe is that more project development know-how is required by the investor, unlike the case of a forward sale where less project development know-how is required. The third difference is that the investor has to engage in a very complex sale and purchase agreement, which is much simpler in the case of a forward sale. The fourth difference you would observe is that developers require actually no or little bank financing under a forward funding arrangement, since the investor is providing the funding in installments depending on the progress made on the development activity. However, in a forward sale situation, the developer would have to find his own money to be able to construct the project, which will then be purchased by the investor. The fifth difference you would observe is that investors pay lower purchase price due to the lower interest rate on the construction loans. So because they are pre-financing the construction project, they tend to pay a lower purchase price overall. But in the forward sale agreement, investors pay higher purchase price due to the higher interest rates that the developers will incur on the bridging finance they take. And then the last difference you would observe is that in a forward funding arrangement, investors often get a better yield. And this is because the purchase price is lower compared to the higher purchase price in the forward sale agreement, which eventually results in a lower investor yield. Yeah, so basically these are the first two alternative project-based finance approaches that developers and investors may enter into or may adopt in financing a real estate development project. Now, in the next video, I will be talking about bridge finance or gap finance. So stay tuned as that lecture comes your way. Thank you. Bye.